The Mafia's Good Girl, Chapter 19. Violet's Point of View. Violet let out a sharp cry as pain splintered through her body. "You're tight," Damon grunted. Violet wanted to punch and kick, but her hands were firmly pinned above her head, and her thighs were forced open with his knees. She couldn't do anything but lay there and took it as Damon was pushing himself as hard as he could into her. Violet felt like her skin was being ripped apart. Tears trickled down her face as the stinging pain reverberated through her body. "You need to relax, or you're gonna hurt yourself," Damon commanded. Violet realized that her muscles were clenching and she was trying to fight him off instinctively. Violet took a deep breath and relaxed herself. The pain began to slowly subside, but the awkward feeling of something penetrating her body persisted. "Good girl. Keep breathing like that." Damon groaned appreciatively. Violet continued taking deep breaths and exhaling. Damon started moving in a rhythm. She could feel him moving deeper and deeper each time. The sharp feeling of pain was gone, but Violet still felt some discomfort, especially every time Damon thrust into her. Violet tipped her head back and closed her eyes. She started counting down the seconds in her mind, silently wishing that time would go faster. Though she knew exactly what was happening, Violet still couldn't wrap her head around what a weird moment this was. She was selling her body to the devil for money. It was such a shameful thing to do. Violet thought she'd feel disgusted with herself, but as of this moment she only felt normal. Violet could hear Damon's low groans filling her ears. "You feel so good." Damon's hands were wrapped around her body tighter, and Violet felt him picking up the pace with his thrusts. Violet's hands were no longer pinned above her head, but she needed something to grasp, so she reached for the sheets and dug her nails into the bed. Damon's ragged breaths filled the air, and Violet felt a fire burning inside her stomach. Everything around her felt heightened, and she was fighting the urge to moan. "You gotta stay still," Damon groaned and held her hips down on the bed. She couldn't squirm or move an inch. She was forced to stay still, while Damon's rock-hard man part throbbing inside her. "Is this it? Is it over?" Damon was quiet and unmoving for the longest time. Violet didn't know what was happening, so she assumed that he was done. But when she opened her eyes to look, Violet realized that she was sorely mistaken. Damon was silent, not because he was done, but because he was admiring something. Violet propped herself up slightly and saw Damon's gaze was stuck on her lower area. She followed his gaze and saw what he was seeing. His man part was only halfway inside her, and there were traces of blood on it. All this time, and he was never fully inside me? Holy moly! Violet's eyes widened in shock, and she suddenly felt dizzy. Here she thought that he was almost done, but Damon hadn't even started. "You're a lot tighter than I expected. This gonna take a while," he said, as he lifted his eyes to see her. Violet swallowed hard in response. His eyes were locked on hers, and his hands were spreading her legs even wider. Then he pulled himself out of her and rested his tip on her entrance. This was the first time Violet saw Damon's length up close and personal. He was big, and he had girth. Violet couldn't even imagine that that thing was inside her. Damon positioned himself and thrust into her again. This time, Damon pushed even deeper than before. He was more than halfway in when Violet's body jerked in response as she felt her walls being stretched so forcefully. "Damon, it hurts," she cried. "I told you it will," he said simply. The immense feeling of pain was back again, and Violet struggled to keep it all together. She was on the verge of crying, and Damon showed no signs of stopping. He would pull back slightly, only to push deeper. "It's not gonna fit inside me," she breathed. "It will," he said. "Trust me." Trust him? Yeah, right. However, before she could say anything in protest, Damon's fingers suddenly landed on her lady part, and Violet gasped in shock. Damon rubbed and teased as he took slow, long strokes. Violet felt a sensation she had never experienced before. It was pain and pleasure all mixed into one. He felt rough, yet gentle, and this was bad, but it felt so good. What is happening here? Violet was losing control of her senses. Damon leaned down and captured her neck in his mouth. He started kissing and sucking on her skin, while his fingers continued working on her sensitive bud. The feeling of pain and discomfort was now gone, and it was replaced by this feeling of lightness. Violet felt her body arching closer to him, like she was asking for more. There was a deep pit building in her stomach, and she was so very close to releasing everything. This is so crazy. Let go. Don't fight it, he murmured to her skin. Damon. Violet couldn't stop herself from moaning his name. Come for me, Violet. She didn't know how or why, but as soon as the words left his lips, her body instantly complied. Her walls clenched tightly, and her body convulsed. Shots of ecstasy coursed through her veins, and Violet let out a scream. Her nails dug deeper into the sheets, and Damon stopped moving for a bit. He watched her in amusement, knowing full well that he had more control over her body than herself at this point. "You're such a good girl," he said. Violet's heart was racing wildly, and her breath was labored. She was still reeling from the high of her orgasm when she felt Damon lifting her left leg and putting them over her right. With her legs crossed tightly, Damon pushed himself into her again. That made Violet's eyes jolted open as she gasped. She caught Damon's eyes, and he smirked at her. His eyes were dark, and the expression on his face said that he was ready to devour her alive. This man is crazy. Damon spent the next few moments pounding into her from this angle. His one hand was pinning her leg down, and the other one circled around her throat. Violet didn't know how this was possible, but she was reaching a peak higher than she ever knew. Damon used the momentum of her last orgasm to push further, and now it felt like she was floating on the clouds. "You all right there?" he said. "Yes," she replied. "Tell me what you feel." "I feel good." "Yeah?" "Yes." "Are you enjoying this?" Violet caught herself before answering him. She knew the answer, but she didn't want to say it. She didn't want to give him that satisfaction. "Answer me," he demanded. And when Violet said nothing, Damon's hand landed on her ass. "Ouch!" she yelped. "It'll hurt more if you fight," he warned her. "Yes," Violet nodded her head pleadingly. "I'm enjoying this." "All right. That's not so hard to be honest, is that?" He let out a low chuckle. Violet was torn by her feelings. She hated herself for liking what Damon was doing to her body. And though at first she wanted this thing to be over and done with, right now she was wanting more and more. Violet's hand grasped the sheets tightly, and she buried her face to the pillow. She thought that by doing this, she could somehow have control over her body. But that was not the case. Damon continued pounding into her and taking her however way he pleased. Her body responded to his movements instinctively, and that was when Violet knew she was completely sold and overtaken by the devil. Violet lost track of time and space. Damon was relentless and dominating. He never gave her time to rest, and he didn't seem to need any of it either. She was being pushed far beyond her limits, and there were moments where Violet was drifting in and out of consciousness. Violet never knew the feeling of being drunk, but she imagined that this might be it. She had no control over her speech or her motor skills. Her vision was blurry, and her body seemed to have a mind of its own. Violet felt like she was having an out-of-body experience. Everything was happening so vividly, like it was a movie. And just as Violet was getting comfortable, Damon suddenly flipped her body around until her stomach was flat on the bed. He snaked a hand around her waist, and he pulled her stomach up so her ass was sticking out. The next thing she knew, Damon's length entered her again, this time from the back. Violet's eyes rolled to the back of her head in response. He felt so big and so deep inside her from this angle. He was hitting her cervix with every stroke. "What do you feel now?" He huffed as he grabbed a fistful of her hair, pulling her face up to him. "I feel like I'm going to explode," she breathed. Keep going, Damon groaned appreciatively as his fingers is back on her lady part. His thrusts grew harder and more feral. But seconds before Violet could find her release, she felt Damon slowing down, denying of her release. Desperate, Violet found herself begging for more, but Damon teased her. "Are you a good girl, Violet?" he said as he rubbed against her so very slowly and sensually, only good girls get to come. "Yes, I am," she cried. "Tell me you're my good girl." Violet didn't immediately respond. Damon then slapped her ass again, right at the same spot. "Say it," he roared. "I'm your good girl, Damon," Violet whimpered helplessly. "I'm your good little girl." "Yes, you are." Damon stifled a laugh and picked up the pace of his thrusts, so deep and hard that it felt like he was going to break her in half. "Now come for daddy, baby girl." And just like that, Violet came unraveling underneath him. She let out a loud scream as the powerful explosion washed over her body. She reached an orgasm that was bigger and more intense than anything she had ever felt before. Damon groaned in response and slowed down his thrusts. He grabbed both her arms and pulled them back, arching her body to mold onto his. Violet couldn't keep her eyes open anymore, and her body was at Damon's complete mercy. He continued plunging into her again and again until all Violet could see were the stars. She didn't know how long she was out for, but when she pried her eyes open next, she could see the sun rising from the window outside. They had been at this for hours, and now the dawn was breaking. But still, Damon was showing no signs of slowing down. He let her have a moment to ride down her orgasm before slowly building her up again. He is so beyond crazy, and I must be too. Damon's point of view. "I've sent the money to your account. You're free to go," Damon said as he grabbed a fresh crisp tie from the drawer and linked it around his neck. He glanced at a tired Violet, who was now waking up on the bed. She was sprawled naked on his bed, with only a thin sheet of silk blanket covering parts of her skin. It took everything inside him not to go over there and fuck her into oblivion again. "Oh," she croaked and pulled herself up, using the blanket to cover her chest and stomach. "Like, right now?" It was 8 in the morning, and Damon was finally done with her. Damon could have kept going, except she was drifting in and out of consciousness, and it was no fun to fake a sleeping girl. Damon finished the deed moments ago, and he jumped into the shower to clean himself. He would have asked her to come along, except she was completely passed out. When he came back from the shower, Damon brought a wet towel and wiped the dried blood on her thighs. Normally, he'd simply kick the girl out and get the maids to clean the sheets. But one look at the sleeping Violet and Damon couldn't do it. "You're the one who kept wanting to leave. Now you're free," Damon scoffed, pausing for a beat before adding, "Why, are you suddenly having a change of heart?" "No," she said quickly. "I'm leaving." Violet looked around the room for her dress, but what was left of it were shreds of fabrics on the floor. Violet sighed and wrapped the blanket over her body before getting up on the floor. Her feet wobbled, and her knees almost gave out when her feet touched the ground. Damon couldn't help but stifle a laugh. He had fucked her so hard that the girl almost couldn't walk. "Just tell Elena where you need to go, and she'll get the driver ready," he said. Violet nodded her head before walking to the door. Damon kept his eyes on her, and he watched her leave. A part of him wished that there was a way to keep her around, but he already did the deed, and their business deal was done. Weirdly enough, Violet suddenly stopped her tracks before she reached for the door. She turned her face halfway to him and muttered, "Thank you." Damon let out a smirk and shook his head. "No, thank you." Violet turned her face again, but Damon could see that she was blushing bright red. It made the smile on his face grew wider. Violet opened the door, and she was about to leave, but Damon called out to her again. "Hey, Violet." Violet stopped dead in her tracks. She already had one foot out the door, but the other one was still inside the room. She turned around to face Damon, and he was striding towards her. He had a playful smirk on his face, and he stretched out his hand to her. "It was a pleasure doing business with you," he said. Violet let out a scoff and shook her head. But then she took his hand, in a bold move, and said, "Likewise."